Chapter 1421, Sure. Silas stood with his arms crossed, looking out of the one-way windows of the vessel as it shook. His feet, however, were practically glued to the ground, his body hardly swaying outside of his hair. What is going on here, Drave, Karen? Why were the gravity arrays activated? An old man shot out from one of the many hidden rooms of the vessel, facing off against the pair of siblings with a frown on his face. Elder Leos, there was no time, we had to act first. Drave quickly spoke to cut his sister off before she started rambling about random nonsense. This was a time-sensitive matter. The elder frowned. Compared to the pair of siblings, his crown of thorns was far thicker, darker, and even seemed to be somewhat cracked in some regions. But these cracks seemed to radiate with a fog of crimson, forming a thin veil of cloudy red that hung above his head like a halo. This halo, vague as it was a sign of a truly powerful Ossaran. Though, because it was so hard to spot, it could be said that this elder Leos was limited in just how much of this power he could tap into. Explain. Cut the nonsense. Drave immediately pivoted when he heard these words. In truth, this training exercise wasn't just for them. There were other Ossarans in the cabin that were focused on their own training. While completing this circuit, they planned to go to another astral dungeon more appropriate for them. The fact Drave had already delayed them by giving up their spot in the queue was already enough to piss the elder off, but he hadn't known about this. Unfortunately, this was different. As expensive as it was to escape a gravity array, deploying one wasn't exactly cheap either. They needed that fuel and those etherstones for the rest of their trip. Using the array when they didn't absolutely need it wasn't just a waste, it might ruin the chances of finishing the astral dungeon circuit they had planned. When Elder Leos heard the explanation, his eyes sharpened. Primus Imperium. There was a flash of almost lightning that came from his gaze. Your actions are a bit too erratic. If what you say is true, the system is not a fool, although there are ways to trick it. If this Primus Imperium cleared the Abyssal Cathedral on his own, you are no match for him, and I cannot help you defeat him. So how exactly are you expecting to get the title? You can't be expecting me to injure him first, right? Although Elder Leos didn't explain any further, what he wanted to say was clear enough. The system would be able to sense something like that and wouldn't count the loss as Silas's. What you say is true, Elder. But I do not believe that things are that simple, and as you say, there are ways to trick the system. Drave flipped a palm and a video of Silas's performance in the Rune Master Tower appeared. I've analyzed this video a few times. If I'm correct, this Silas Grimblade has a rare time-will ability that he can map onto his rune mastery. This is likely what was acknowledged, and he became the Primus Lumina of this sector. Elder Leos frowned. A Primus Lumina and Primus Imperium in a single body. Drave had not mentioned this before. The Abyssal Cathedral is difficult not because of the enemies, but because of the environment. But to this Silas Grimblade, this environment would make him stronger, not weaker. I don't believe his stats are as strong as ours. He is just well suited to clearing the Abyssal Cathedral. I acted to activate the gravity array first because so long as we can stop him from escaping, then we should be able to defeat him. Even if the system chooses not to grant me his Primus Imperium title, the reward for defeating him will still be quite great. It would be invaluable for not only building my foundation, but also the coming event. Drave and Karen were older than one might expect for an F-tier of the Ossarans. They were in their late teens, but this was usually the age of their E-tiers. A 28-year-old like Silas would already be in the D-tier for most of them, and this was the tier they would spend the most of the prime of their lives in. They were still in the F-tier purely for the sake of the coming Crown Beast Sanctum event. Elder Leos listened to Drave's explanation calmly, not interrupting a single time, but as Drave finished up, he felt his heart sink. He was too used to this elder. His expression right now, it was the expression he had when he wasn't impressed by a single thing he was seeing or hearing. Yes, are you finished? Elder Leos asked. Drave gulped. Yes. So your assessment is that someone who can use the environment of a dungeon to their benefit instead of detriment is weaker than you. Drave's gaze flickered. Elder, if you put it like that, you don't understand anything. It's clear you're still a child. Do you think the Primus Imperium title is just handed out to anyone? It appears so rarely that you don't understand it in the slightest. A Primus Imperium title is a title of conquest. There isn't a single aspect, a single thing of the F tier this entire sector could throw at this young man that he wouldn't be able to defeat with ease. That includes anything ever produced by this sector. You don't understand anything. It's clear you're still a child. Do you think the Primus Imperium title is just handed out to anyone? It appears so rarely that you don't understand it in the slightest. A Primus Imperium title is a title of conquest. There isn't a single aspect, a single thing of the F tier this entire sector could throw at this young man that he wouldn't be able to defeat with ease. That includes anything ever produced by this sector. Including this astral dungeon. Drave's pupils trembled. You don't just become a Primus Imperium by being a slight tick stronger than the last strongest Imperium. And you certainly don't become the first Imperium so casually. You want to challenge this Primus Imperium. Sure, go into the dungeon alone and beat his record. Then I'll care enough to waste resources on this foolishness. Elder Leos waved a hand. Release the array before. Boom. The gravity array shook and then shattered. Chapter 1422, Planning. Drave's expression turned pale as paper while Elder Leos froze in place. The glass of the vessel cracked and their entire ship swayed. They all turned over just in time to see the speedboat-like vessel that Silas and the other rode in zipping into the distance. Elder Leo's expression dimmed, his gaze slowly turning back to Drave. Karen, who had mostly been silent all this while, doing her best to get her brother's attention but failing, softly took a step back and hid behind him. She had been trying to tell Drave that if Silas had enough money to waste to fuse 5 top-of-the-line ships together like that, then he certainly had enough money to break a gravity array. Plus, this wasn't a combat ship, it was a traveling ship. It was designed for comfortability and also had training rooms so that they didn't slack on their improvement. The gravity arrays weren't nearly as strong as the best their race had. The odds that Silas would be able to break free at some cost was high. And if that happened? Elder Leo's jaw clenched and then his aura spread out in all directions. He didn't have time to scold Drave right now. If he didn't do something, their entire ship would collapse into the planet below. Before Drave could even sigh in relief, though, he noticed something that made his expression completely pale. Silas' vessel had come to a stop in the distance, just outside the range of the abyssal cathedral. Silas stood in silence, watching the near destruction of the Osaran's vessel. He wasn't surprised by this. In fact, he had calculated it. The gravity array, as he had said, was mostly used as an auxiliary array. It insulated especially large vessels from influencing the gravity of the various moons, planets, and even stars they came across. This was especially important when the vessel in question was coming from a higher level sector to a lower level one like this one. Because of its function in hiding the mass of an entire ship, it was embedded into the very core of the vessel. It was integrated into its entire frame and body. There were ships well designed to not break even after the gravity array was shattered. But, this wasn't a combat vessel. And, Brahma was well versed in exactly the amount of velocity you needed to do the most damage. If Silas had told Brahma to just get away, the damage to the Osaran's vessel wouldn't be so great. However, because Silas said only go as far as to leave the range of the dungeon and regain suppression foe the system territory. It was almost like peeling a waxy layer back slowly rather than ripping it off quickly. One might think going more slowly was better, but instead that gave it more room to tear and rip the flesh and skin, peeling it off instead of the hair you were aiming for. The moment Silas gave his order, Brahma knew what he wanted of him, and instantly aimed for maximum damage. The irony of it all was that this much damage cost much less to inflict, but it cost the Osarans so much more. Do you recognize that ship? Silas asked Brahma, not looking over his shoulder. You mean the make and model? No, it's impossible to memorize so many different kinds. Brahma replied by Andromeda. What do you know about it? It should be a vessel designed for living rather than battle. Probably more like a traveling home. Silas nodded in agreement. He had thought so too. Send him a message, he suddenly said. Say, if you want your ship fixed, feel free to follow. But to bring adequate payment. After saying this, Silas waved a hand. Let's head back to the sanctum. Alex blinked. We're already done. Silas nodded. We're not going to other warlord grade dungeons. Not the astral dungeons. We'll go to the Amiperine one after this. After that, we return to Earth. Usually, Alex felt like he had a good hold on what Silas wanted to do. But this baffled him. Silas had only just gotten 150,000 or so war points. That was enough to trade for one of the lesser lineages, but that was obviously not his goal. So what was he doing? However, he wasn't the one controlling the ship, that was old Brahma. Old Leo's sea tierwall was the only thing keeping the vacuum of space from blowing out the windows entirely. As he did so, the engineers were all hard at work, repairing things. But at best, they could do patchwork. They had enough material for regular maintenance, but at this point the ship needed a complete overhaul. Drave and Karen could only look toward one another with dismay, and it was at that moment a message came in. This time, the control panels had long been taken from the two teens. Clearly they couldn't be trusted with such things anymore, so the message was quickly relayed to old Leo's. The old elder frowned, not quite understanding what was going on. A trap. They had tried to keep Silas here, and now he was offering to help them. Who would believe that? However, the last line about adequate payment. It left Elder Leo's frowning. Was tart something you would add if you weren't serious? In addition, they weren't waiting. They had already shot into the distance, vanishing as though they didn't care whether the Osarans followed or not. I've got to say, SYL, I really don't know what you're thinking this time. Care to share? Alex asked, blinking like a curious kitten. Silas didn't reply. Are you sure they'll come? They'll come, Silas said. Alex was surprised again, because Silas actually replied this time. He was sure he wouldn't get a reply. Why's that? Because they know the rules will protect them. Alex's brows jumped. Suddenly, he understood the rules Silas was talking about were those of the sanctum. But when had Silas confirmed they were from another sanctum? And what was he planning? Something told Alex that the moment Silas saw them give up the position in the queue, he had been planning this. Chapter 1423. Nothing to do with it. The vessel snapped out of hyperspace, the hub of the Milky Way sector looming beneath them. We have spare parts, right? Silas asked, looking toward old Brahma who nodded in return. At this point, the old man didn't know why Silas asked him these questions. He had clearly come here knowing that they definitely had spare parts. What if old Brahma said no? Would they just have made a wasted trip? Either way, it was true. After fusing 5 ships together into this singular, sleek behemoth, it was only natural that there be many redundant parts. Old Brahma had planned to sell them piecewise after although this blew over, but he was a bit busy still tinkering and refining this one. So it wasn't as though he had all the time in the world to deal with those matters. Good, stock 'em up into a spatial device. Then we'll set off again. Soon, they were up and away again. A distance away, the Osarans were trailing behind them at a cautious distance, but not one that seemed overly afraid either. Silas wasn't foolish enough to try and end them. Not only would he not gain much from it, it wouldn't necessarily be possible. A ship like that one definitely had escape pods, and there were definitely powerhouses on it. Even heavily suppressed, old Brahma couldn't possibly fight all of them. The fact the Osarans dared to come in the first place meant that if they were cornered, they would be prepared to deal with the situation. But on a deeper level than that, what options did they have with a ship in that state? Going to a nearby sanctum was their best bet. They might be separate in their eyes, but under the eyes of the Emperor Sanctum, they were one. And there were rules to ensure such. Silas stepped into the sanctum's hub. It had barely been a few days since the last time he was here, and the only reason it took so long was because of the distances they had to cross the queue waiting time. However, he was still at the top of the leaderboards with a nice plus 147,000 points for his troubles. Silas didn't go to the exchange post, though. Instead, he returned to Scorpion Sanctum, using their teleportation channels and then hopping onto the hollow wings back. In a few blinks, it seemed that he had already returned to the mountain range of Grelith's disciples, the winds raging and roaring around him. With a step, he leapt off the hollow wings back as it soared back into the hibernation realm. It seemed to only be growing fonder of that place these days. Silas wasn't sure exactly why just yet, but the hollow wings foundation seemed to be growing sturdier due to the hibernation realm. It should be because the hollow wing was just a baby that was growing into maturity. But that answer was still quite shocking because the acceleration of maturity in the hibernation realm should be extremely exaggerated. How was it that the hollow wing was still improving? Just how long would it take to reach maturity if the equivalent of tens of thousands of years wasn't enough? Scylla's gaze flickered, but he tossed this matter to the back of his mind. No matter how strong the hollow wing great, its main limitation was still himself. Combat mounts scaled with the person, so until there came a day when the hollow wing couldn't keep up, it wasn't quite worth it to invest too much thought into it, not when Gogo was still lagging so far behind. "You've returned." Grelith's voice echoed in Scylla's ears though he hadn't appeared. "There's an interesting opportunity," Scylla said. "Oh. Right about now, my servant is helping the Osarans fix their ship." Grelith didn't reply for a long while when he heard this. Quote ellipsis. "You're going to kill the bat lineage. The bat lineage are going to get themselves killed. I, on the other hand, had nothing to do with it." Boom. The scorpion lineage suddenly shook. Scylla didn't seem surprised by the shaking on the moon. The shaking on the Sanctum's planet should be several times worse. You see, the trouble with being like the chaosheir and overextending yourself so much was that it was all too easy to re-aggravate your pulled muscle, and you were also all too sensitive. It had been quite a while since Scylla's killed Israel, but if he had to guess, and he certainly always guessed well, the young man probably had a great status in the chaosheir clan. In fact, that was an understatement. In truth, Israel was the leader of this generation of chaosheir. He was the firstborn of the patriarch and matriarch of this generation, and he was the leading figure amongst their F-tiers. Despite being level 50, if not for the suppression, his stats would have been superior to even Zolt, who had been a level 64 E-tier when Scylla killed him. Scylla didn't know if the Osarans were involved in the matters of the Thriskai or not, but it didn't matter if they were. They certainly were now. It wasn't very difficult at all. All Scylla had to do was let Brahma leave a few of Israel's things on the ship. As for what happened from there, it certainly didn't have anything to do with him, now did it? The chaosheir could only blame themselves for constantly provoking him, and the Osarans could only blame themselves for actually not training their F-tiers well enough to know who to target and who not to. Scylla flipped a palm and took out his war point system badge. He had a feeling that it was about to have a nice change in points. As expected, the moment Scylla did, there was a rapid change of the numbers. They kept jumping, leaping upward. In a flashing instant, they crossed over 5 million points and they were still climbing. Not bad. The numbers didn't stop pinging until they hit just under 10 million war points. 9649500 C-grade war points. Chapter 1424, Past Feats. Scylla flipped the badge on his finger, letting it flip. He wasn't surprised by the change at all. In fact, this was his original plan. Well, not exactly like this, because even he couldn't have known that the Osarans would appear and then choose to target him. 3 months from now, the Milky Way's transformation would be complete and it would for a high-level silver-grade galaxy. At that point, he planned to return and see what benefits he could gain from the changes with his current power. During that time, he planned on finding a method of using the War Point System badge to get it to acknowledge his participation in the galaxy's evolution, or maybe he would find a way to make his galaxy progenitor status official. If he could do that under the effects of the War Point System, then the points would pour in with complete ease. This was why he had contacted Kasari back then. Part of what she was preparing now would be the things they would need to accomplish the goals back in the Milky Way. The two planned to make the galaxy their own. After all, should they fail to become galaxy progenitors, it would become their child's by right. For all intents and purposes, in name, the Milky Way galaxy was already theirs to command. All Scylla really needed to do, even if all of those plans fell through, was to follow Thora and establish his legendary city stellae in the Milky Way. That action alone would cause the points to jump wildly and with naked abandon. This was why Scylla never bothered to waste energy getting angry with the actions of the warlords. Everything would be his anyway, so why waste his time thinking about them? He had only jumped from dungeon to dungeon like he had to first, train, but more importantly than that, increase his prestige. Rune mastery was something that too little people understood, and the fact they were foolish enough to doubt him because he was tired after Beckermine the Primus Lumina went to show that the public was too easily swayed. If Silas wanted chaosheir to be untouchable in the petals of the seeing thorn, his reputation had to also be unimpeachable. Now that he owned first place in practically every F-tier dungeon in the entire sector, including an astral dungeon, who could still doubt him? Soon, news of him taking first place in the Abyssal Cathedral dungeon would spread and cause its own uproar. But those matters already had nothing to do with him. His main focus right now was the Amiparine dungeon. It was truly too intriguing. As for what happened between the Osarans and the Bat lineage, he didn't care. He was just using them as a trigger to make the warpoint system recognize actions he had taken before this event began. Because the Osarans being attacked by the Bat lineage would be inseparable from his actions in the Milky Way, the badge had no choice but to factor that into its calculations, and now, Silas was in a situation he was all too used to. More wealth than he knew what to do with. Calmly, Silas ignored the carnage and battle behind him as he walked up to a familiar young woman of the cheetah lineage. "Hello, I'd like to trade for the E-grade and D-grade whale, ape, serpent, and lion lineages. I would also like the F-grade ape, serpent, and lion lineages as well." Silas pushed his badge forward. The cheetah lineage young woman trembled from head to toe. She was still trying to understand whether she should even be here right now or not. But when she saw Silas' points, and saw that there was no mistake, she didn't even know what to say. Was she even allowed to do this? Silas just stood there, looking at her without a word. She was a D-tier herself, but for some reason, standing before this man, it felt like she could die to a single one of his fingers. She didn't dare to defy him, and the points were here. She gulped. In the end, in order to prevent the lineages from going back on their word, Grelith had forced all of the lineages to store their lineages ahead of time. This way, as soon as Silas earned his points, he could take them without their input or attempts at stalling. They thought that they had enough failsafes, but unfortunately for them, they didn't. Silas could have traded for a few C-grade lineage as well, but he didn't bother. For one, he knew not to go so far. It wasn't worth it. They would be enraged by him taking the D-grade ones for sure, but if he took the C-grade ones, it might be enough to break all cordiality. For something he couldn't even use, it wouldn't be worth it. And in Silas' opinion, by the time he could comprehend C-grade runes, he wouldn't give a single damn about these lineages at all. Silas swept a hand and stored everything into the madness key. For the first time, he looked toward the battle to find the Bat lineage warlord fighting it out with Elder Leos. Idiot. Silas shook his head when he looked toward Biomad. There was another reason he was so sure this would work, and that wasn't because of Israel's things. That was because of a third party who thought themselves to still be so well hidden in the shadows. The 713th Tiger Warlord. Silas' gaze shifted and they landed on Scarvel, who was standing and looking at all of this with a frown on his face. Everyone was so shocked by the current change that none of them had even seen the change to Silas' war points yet. Well, some certainly had. But no one that could actually make important decisions. Anyone who could make such decisions were focused on the fact there was a war of C-tiers going on in their skies. And as expected, the very last to arrive was the Tiger Warlord. There was one apparent slip-up in Silas' plan, though. The moment the dust settled, the true murderer of Israel would be exposed. Whether or not he had a plan for that, maybe only he knew. Chapter 1425, Used. Silas stood, watching the battle above as though it had nothing at all to do with him. Though, the fact he could even begin to follow such a battle at all was a testament to something maybe even more shocking than the fact he had been the cause of it all. However, Silas didn't stand there for long. The conclusion didn't matter much to him, not when he had things to do. With a step, he returned to his own ship. Even though the Battle of the C-tiers was causing a great amount of destruction, the Sanctum Hub was the central location of the Beast Walrod Sanctum itself. It was well protected. As for Silas' ship, it was built to cross galaxies. The Battle of the C-tiers could shake it, but unless there was a direct attack against it, it likely wouldn't be very affected. And even in the case there was a direct attack, it was more likely that the attacker would be harmed than the ship itself. Let's go, Brammer. Old Brammer looked toward Silas, then toward the leaderboard in the distance, and then back. He could never understand this young man. All he knew was that he had been used somehow, but he wasn't even sure how it had happened. A sudden shout echoed through the vessel. "Ignore them." Old Brahma just nodded and booted the ship up. In a flash, they were already blasting out of the atmosphere and jetting off into the distance. In another flash, the sanctum's moons and planet were nothing more than dots in the sky, little different from the twinkling stars. Boom. Priyan landed in the location Scylla's vessel had just taken off from, his eyes spitting fire. He didn't know what just happened, and he wasn't even aware that it had been Scylla's ship he just tried to stop, but any ship leaving in this situation, given the volatility of it all, was bound to be suspicious. However, Tart's ship had actually ignored him. Damn it, what the hell is happening here? It had to be remembered how much trouble Scylla's went through to come to the sanctum in the first place. Enemies couldn't just easily cross the distance through the galaxy and make it here. The exact location of the sanctum wasn't even well known by them in the first place. But now, these Osarans had suddenly appeared, and whatever they had done had pissed off the Bat lineage enough. They had practically started an all-out war right here. Enough. The voice of Elder Leos boomed and his body flashed with crimson. The eyes of the 713th Ape Warlord changed as twinkling halo solidified around Elder Leo's head. Smashing out a palm, the Biomad found himself taking 3 heavy steps back in the air, every step causing a pillar of concentrated air to spear the ground below. The blasted rebounded against the barriers protecting the hub, shaking their runes and causing the entire planet to quake. Biomad's eyes narrowed. "Ape," he said coldly, "what is the meaning of this? You attack us without warning, and then want to question me." Elder Leo's voice boomed. "If not for the suppression of this territory, do you think the likes of you could last even a single exchange against me? You are lucky I am not acting to kill you where you stand." Biomad's slight confusion turned entirely cold. His back straightened and his aura began to climb. "Are you under the impression that this is all the power I have?" Elder Leos believed that he was suppressed while Biomad wasn't. But this wasn't the case. Joining the 073 Sanctum made integration into this system territory faster, as fast as a month of time. However, even though it had been over 3 months now, Biomad had still been restricting himself to pre-suppression levels. The Kyeltha had overextended themselves, and the main family was somewhat leaving the Bat lineage out to dry because of the continuous failures. So, laying low was the best option. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. Just now, he was likewise battling Elder Leos in a suppressed state. But as far as Biomad was concerned, this was an opportunity to turn things around. If he could give the Patriarch and Matriarch their son's murderer, then the Bat lineage might be able to gain support from the main clan once again and turn things around. He was unresigned. He couldn't stand the fact that he had lost her child again and again, and was now being forced to just sit on his hands and wait for orders. If it required showing his real strength to take Elder Leos down, then he didn't mind exposing it. Elder Leo's eyes narrowed. He looked toward where Scylla's ship had been, but his own expression turned ugly when he saw that the ship was actually gone. He had had no choice but to give his full and undivided attention to the battle. Unless there was danger involved, he wouldn't notice it at all. But even if he had noticed, it wouldn't matter. Elder Leos took a breath, feeling that he had been played somehow, but not quite understanding how just yet. Even if Brahma had entered their ship with something incriminating, how had things progressed so quickly? They had barely been here a handful of minutes. Scylla's had to have directed Biomad's attention to them somehow, but how could he have done that without it being blatantly obvious that he was using Biomad as an attack dog? And also, to what end? What reason would Scylla's have to do this? Just to kill them? There was no way the others would let it go that far. They were all sanctums. The implications of such a thing would be too great. What Elder Leos still hadn't realized was that Biomad wasn't his attack dog. The 713th Tiger lineage was his attack dog. There wasn't just one pirate fleet in Beast Warlord Sanctum. The feat of Scylla's completely wiping one of them out seemed to have been too easily forgotten, but maybe that was because there were 2 more. But this time, instead of destroying them, Scylla's used them. Chapter 1426, Where to Reply. To Elder Leos, it had only been a few minutes since he was here. But to Silas and the 713th Tiger Warlord, this matter had been set in motion for hours already. Well, to Silas it was over a day. Silas understood the territory of the pirates quite well now. On the way here, he had purposely taken Elder Leos and the Osarans through a path near the edges of the territory of one of them. From his understanding of how organizations like this worked, the moment one fell, the others would leap at the chance to swallow their territory. But, not enough time had passed in order for them to fully swallow what was left of the pirate group Silas had destroyed. That left them in a situation where they had presence in certain regions, but weren't organized to lead all-out assaults just yet. And that was a perfect middle ground for Silas to take advantage of, especially if he was of the opinion that more than just one of these groups was under the control of the Tiger lineage. It was then Silas laid his trap. Long before he even reached the sanctum, the 713th Tiger Warlord had already been alerted that a group that had been likely responsible for the Kyeltha prince's death was on the way here. By the time old Brahma was planting evidence, he was only adding a bit of polish to a well-groomed bride. That was only extra incentive for Biomat to attack, something more obvious and less subtle than the first plant had been. Something that would enrage Biomat the moment he appeared. Silas barely had to do anything, and why would he? The 713th Tiger Warlord would handle everything for him. At the same time, Elder Leos would feel like the timeline was too tight for Silas to truly be responsible for this. Even if Elder Leos suspected Silas at first, by the time the situation settled down and he learned of the war points, he would realize that Silas would have plenty of other reasons to be in such a rush to leave. Of course, Elder Leos would have a stench on him he couldn't wipe away even if he wanted to. Under normal circumstances, that is. Silas already knew exactly how things would play out. That was because if he was correct, the 713th Tiger Warlord would find a way out for Leos, one that damaged the Kyeltha even more. The best part of this plan. The Bat lineage would end up taking the blame for being the reason Silas could trade for the lineages in the first place. In the end, Silas would get three things he wanted. First, evidence of the Tiger lineage's betrayal. Second, the legacies he wanted. And third, the expulsion of the Bat lineage. Jalla stood in a training room across from Alex, huffing for breath. In fact, both of them seemed to be quite close to the edge, but that was only because Alex was heavily suppressing himself, deciding to spar with Jalla for a bit. I still don't understand. How will he get those three things? Jalla asked mostly through gritted teeth. Evidence is obvious enough, no. The moment the Tiger Warlord acted on the information he gained from the pirates, Silas had what he needed. Fine, let's say that's true, but how will the fact he got the legacies be blamed on the Bat lineage? Obviously because of the Tiger Warlord. What? The Tiger Warlord is on the side of the Pervan clan. They gain nothing if the Bat lineage successfully kills the Osarans. But if they frame the Bat lineage for planting evidence instead, then the Bat lineage will be at the end of their rope. They were too weak to beat the Scorpion lineage, and now they're stirring up trouble with much more powerful sanctums. They're not powerful enough to make a difference and they're causing too much trouble. They'll inevitably be kicked out by the other lineages at this point. They'll get blamed for it because Silas was the one that brought him to the sanctum in the first place. If the sanctum chooses to kick him out, the warlords will assume the war point system was only giving Silas credit for being the instigator. After all of the previous failures of the Kyeltha were also the result of Silas. So it would make sense that the war point system would credit it all to Silas. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. The realization suddenly hit Jalla like a furious tide. So you mean to say that he gets evidence against a hidden enemy, destroys the enemy out in the open, makes the life of someone who offended him a living hell, comes out richer and more information wealthy. All while not being blamed for any of it at all. Alex looked at Jalla with a tilt of his head and then smiled. Even the Tiger Warlord would be an unwitting accomplice, unlikely to realize that Silas was the true mastermind behind it all. In the Tiger Warlord's opinion, Silas was too good of a spearhead to get rid of too easily. After all, Silas was basically single-handedly crushing the Kyeltha's chances of becoming the next demigod clan on his own. Why get rid of an ally too early? The Tiger Warlord had even set up things in a way such that Silas would come out completely clean. Either that, or the mastermind behind it all certainly would. I haven't told you this before, but you've heard of legacy, haven't you? Jala's expression became deathly cold. Legacy. While Silas had been the one to kill his uncle, it could be said that the real reason his family was dead was because of them. What they do best is evaluate valuable targets, whether those are planets or people. It's rare that they will let anything go. In fact, if they can't control something, they're even more likely to want it. Their final evaluation of Silas was as clear-cut as it gets. And I tend to believe them. Final evaluation: steer clear of Silas Brown. It is impossible to tell what level this boy's intellect has reached. I have watched him since he was young, and even I do not understand him. I recommend that the organization kill this boy while he has yet to grow, or else there will be unforetold consequences in the future. Jala's pupils trembled, reading the notification Alex was sharing with him again and again as though to memorize every stroke. Unfortunately for them, they ended up getting lost in the source a bit. But I don't blame them. It's only because of Silas that they managed to crack the secrets of the first race of Earth. Without Silas spearheading things and solving their puzzles, neither you nor I would even be here. Alex turned to Jala even more seriously than before. You're wasting your time here, Jala. If you don't get your head on straight, he will kill you, and he won't hesitate for even a single moment. I tried to go against him once, and then the man went and shot his luck up so high that I was actually randomly teleported right into his lap. But now that I think about it, even if I evaded him that one time, there was no telling if I'd be able to do it a second or a third. If you really want your family to have a chance at its revenge, I advise you seriously consider where you want to apply that stubbornness of yours. Chapter 1427, Come. Silas sat in a private room. He had found that he was getting too attached to the ways of this world, so there were a lot of things about his environment that he was changing. Why did he have to wear robes or armor everywhere when he much preferred business casual? Why did he have to cross his legs in some sort of meditative state when he had to comprehend something, when he much preferred sitting in a chair? Why did he have to rely on the research of others when he much preferred doing his own? He hadn't forgotten that one of the quests he had received for his vipermancy profession required building a lab within it. He still hadn't had an opportunity to do this, but he did know the direction to take. A city stele was definitely the bare minimum requirement, but he had to use his legendary city stele to give chaosheir the leverage she needed to protect herself. As far as he was concerned, her safety was more important, especially since the role she would play in his future was not small. Silas still had a legendary city stele ticket he hadn't used, but he had a feeling that even as a Primus Imperium, he wouldn't last more than a few seconds in such a challenge. He needed to become much more powerful first, and he had plenty of plans for that. From Silas' understanding, the stele tickets were adjusted based on one's tier. After all, they appeared on summoned worlds for a reason. There was no tier one needed to have to become a city lord. Instead, it was a measure of one's potential. That meant, Silas growing strong enough within the F tier was Silas' best chance at clearing those requirements. But for now, and until he was confident enough to do that, he was taking another approach. He would settle for a more normal lab for now. Well, this space was half a training room and half a lab. It could become either depending on Silas' whims. When it was the latter, Andromeda would be hooked right into things here, accelerating his analysis when he so needed it. Right now, though, he didn't need it. Laid out before him on a stainless steel table were 3 orbs. One had a crimson ape pounding its chest and howling into the skies in it. Another had a snake with violet scales and beautiful eyes, slithering about in a rhythmic dance that hypnotized the senses. The last was a lion of shocking gold. It stood on a mountain, regal and proud, as though looking down on the world. Silas looked at the lion lineage for a moment. Originally, he only traded for it to piss Prion off. He didn't care for it in the slightest. Maybe in the future, he would destroy it just to prove a point. However, looking at it now, he couldn't help but shake his head. Truly pathetic. It was like a shell, having little to no power of its own. But unfortunately, it was useful. Useful not for what it brought itself, but instead what it could bring to the serpent lineage. It had a false sense of pride but lacked the substance, while the serpent lineage had the substance but lacked the pride. Together, they would be what the serpent lineage was actually meant to be. If Silas could fuse them together, he actually saw a path that could force Gogo's gene locks to be unwound ahead of time. Right now, the system pegged Gogo as a gold beast, and yet despite being so apparently powerful, Gogo's stats were only in the double digits after adjustments. That was because too much of Gogo's power was locked behind his genes. And now, his sense nearby paths aspect of his insight path talent was telling him that he could use this lion lineage to help his contract. Silas crossed his arms, his eyes calm. Not yet. With a flick of his finger, Silas put the serpent and lion lineage orbs away. He still felt like he was missing something. But on the table right now, there was something more pressing he needed to grasp first. He had yet to absorb the ape gene because he wanted to progress it to the same level his scorpion gene was at. Now he had the capital to do that with the original legacy before him. Silas closed his eyes, drawing the ape warlord armor in a single instant of time. He felt something stir inside him as he perfected it well and truly for the first time. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. His hair stood on end, a lineage hidden deep within him stirring. There. This was completely unlike the scorpion. Silas had needed Grelith to paint the path forward before him. Without Grelith's sacrifice that day, it might have taken Silas much longer to sense the Emperor Scorpion armor. However, while some might think Silas was the most compatible with the serpent armor, this was far from the case. The armor he was by far the most compatible with was this one. The Ape Warlord armor. That was because he descended from the great apes. He had a legendary gene class that had mutated and transformed his body. And, maybe just as importantly as any one of these, he had the madness comprehension within him. On top of all of this, the Silas of back then had yet to perfect his spark seed. He was 10 times the rune master now than he was back then. He could see the Ape Emperor armor so clearly now it might as well have been the Emperor lineage before him right now rather than the Warlord lineage. However, taking that path now would be an enormous risk. He had had his legendary gene stolen once before, and having it stolen once again was very possible if he was too careless. Thanks to Grelith, however, Silas knew something now that he hadn't known before. There was no item spirit to rat on him here. Would the Ape Emperor lineage sense him? Yes. But would they be able to pinpoint exactly where he was? A flicker of crimson lit Silas' eyes. In the back of those eyes, there seemed to be a different sort of plan forming, one that a certain of an Emperor Scorpion lineage would never see coming. Come. The roar of an ape filled the ship, shaking it from side to side. Chapter 1428, A Risk. Silas didn't know what an Empyrean dungeon was, not really. He knew that it was something of high level, he knew it was far more dangerous than an astral dungeon, and he knew that this one wasn't located in the Milky Way sector, but instead another sector. However, he did know two things. The first was that his luck was warning him not to. The second was that he had to go. Everyone was worried about the Thriskai and the next move, or maybe the Sanctum and their coming challenge, but this wasn't what Silas was concerned about at all. Playing games of chess with the Thriskai or the Pervan, or helping or blocking the Sanctum's path to success, he didn't care about any of that. He only had one goal and one goal alone. Be strong. His movements were just the same as they were on Earth, moving toward the greatest places of danger and pitting himself up against them. These clever moves that rocked entire organizations were little more than background noise to him. Silas' Ape Warlord armor was formed again, only to shatter, and then form again. Every time he formed it, it was slightly different, but no matter the changes he made, it was a perfect 100% mastery every time without the slightest chance of failure. He drew them as though he was casually breathing, but every time he did so, it seemed as though the armor was growing darker, blacker, more sinister. It wasn't good enough to embody rage. Silas didn't want fury to dictate his armor, he wanted a controlled madness, a comprehension of oneself that allowed one to tap into one's emotions and yet didn't cloud the vision or the mind. Madness. It had been a long time since Silas had had a breakthrough in his madness comprehension. It sat at bronze grade and progenitor mastery, but every step upward was like climbing straight up without the slightest hint of a slope. It didn't help that with the true pride seed, his desire for self-reflection and improvement had gone down the gutter. He was perfect. What need did he have for such a thing? At least, that was what a normal pride seed wielder would be thinking. Silas wasn't thinking this, however. It was just that making enormous breakthroughs in your mindset and understanding wasn't as easy the more of yourself you were accepting of. Silas had already progressed his comprehension beyond a level most would ever touch in the F tier. Expecting more was likely expecting too much. Even so, this comprehension was more than enough to elevate the ape warlord lineage to a completely new level. By the time Silas had reformed the armor for the 5th time, it was practically oozing a black aura, the hints of crimson that had once colored it being overwhelmed and washed away. And yet, Silas still shattered it again, and then once more after that. No matter how many times he formed it, he seemed to be completely uninterested in the result. Not good enough. Still not good enough. Silas paused, his eyes cold as he stared out into space. He was missing something. The first layer of the armor was a movement technique that layered into their methods of attack. When Silas first saw it, it reminded him a lot of Primal Step. The second layer of the armor was a projection of will a lot like madness, dimming the will of an opponent to do battle. The third layer was like Berserk. However, this was just the warlord armor, and it wasn't immediately obvious what weakness needed to be shored up. For the Scorpion warlord armor, it was plainly obvious to Silas. Earth Escape had no business existing within the abilities of its layers. But whether it was the movement, attack method, the will projection, or Berserk, all of them seemed to be in line with the path of the ape. Except. Silas' eyes flashed. He remembered that disgusting feeling he had gotten when he first drew the armor, that desire to crouch down onto all fours and run on his limbs that way. That's the problem. Silas had fixed that problem so quickly he had forgotten that it was a problem. But those habits, they were still engrossed in the armor. That small thing changed everything. When the first layer was used, it made the movement more heavily reliant on all 4 limbs instead of just 2. When the second layer was used, it took the shape of howls as though a wild beast instead of a controlled predator. When the third layer was used, it made one lose their minds for the amplification of power instead of amplifying strength in exchange for stamina and blood alone. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. The reason the problem wasn't as plainly obvious as it was with the Scorpion was because the problem was the entire armor. Chi. Silas shattered it all again, his madness comprehension brewing. His eyes turned the slightest sheen of red as his hair rose. Tar, tar, tar. One shingle after another slapped into place. This time, they weren't black at all, but a familiar shimmering elder layered with runes of dense crimson. SHUUU. Silas' claws lengthened, his canines becoming more prominent as he seemed to grow a half-meter in height. His muscles rippled, tearing his dress shirt to pieces as his frame pressed up against it. However, even as the last pieces fell into place, Silas wasn't looking at himself at all. His eyes were completely and utterly focused on the gene of black, emerald, and crimson hovering before him. F-grade legendary gene detected. Silas seemed almost too calm looking at it. It only seemed natural that something of this caliber form for him. He was destined to be the strongest not because it was what he deserved, but simply because he was the best. With a thought, he brought something out. Glyphspire Crucible, Legacy Treasure. It seemed that it was finally time to use this properly. His reward from the Abyssal Cathedral gave him exactly what he needed. Chapter 1429, Abyssal Echo. The Glyphspire Crucible was one of the rewards that Silas received from his quest in the Milky Way. Its abilities were still a bit vague to him, and though he had paid the little girl for an explanation, what he had gotten out of it wasn't as sharp and detailed as he would have liked. According to the little girl, the Glyphspire Crucible was almost like a portal lab of sorts. Though it was called a legacy treasure, there wasn't an actual legacy within it, because the point of its existence was to experiment and use it to craft a new legacy. Essentially, the Crucible, though it just seemed to be a small thimble, was actually like the clone of a body. You could map it onto the aspects and details of yourself, then play with the layers of your body on it first to understand what paths would be best suited for you, what could work well, and what wouldn't work well. Once things were perfected and everything was set in stone to your liking, or once the Glyphspire Crucible had run out of resources to change or be manipulated anymore, then the Crucible could be absorbed into the body. Once this happened, it could instantly graft what changes you caused to it onto your body, allowing the changes that took place to happen within yourself. This way, you could skip all of the risks and problems associated with experimenting on your body. It was essentially Scylla's path toward having a vipermancy profession for himself, though with extra steps. The trouble with the Crucible, though, was that it wasn't perfect, though nothing was. The Crucible wasn't a perfect reflection of the body, and it wasn't easily able to account for things that made Scylla's different. For example, if Scylla started creating a legacy with the serpent as a foundation, the Crucible would never be able to incorporate the ape after the fact. The Crucible could never account for the fact that Scylla's will was broken compared to other F-tiers and that he could withstand the clashing of two different beast wills within himself. This was just one example, but one could imagine that this could be repeated in all sorts of ways. The Crucible was also unable to replicate things like the Sin Seeds, or even Scylla's Spark Seed for that matter either. It was highly limited and highly specialized in what it could do. It was useful, but Scylla's really had no reason to use it until now. Originally, Scylla's thought of using it as a shortcut to comprehend his Archon casting abilities and perfect his Spark Seed. Although to normal people, time and space didn't mix, that was obviously not the case in real life. The Crucible might be able to succeed because of that if Scylla's manipulated some things. But in the end, Scylla's realized that if he relied on an external item for a comprehension like that, he would never be able to escape the system in the end. So, the Crucible had sat there for a long while, collecting dust despite its shocking value until Scylla's cleared the Abyssal Cathedral and gained a new treasure. Scylla's wanted to be able to use his Crucible to reforge the foundation of his body. If he could manage to find a worthy legacy, then the weakness of his flesh especially could be turned around. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. But he had too many wills within him, and trying to adjust for them all would never work. He knew that it was possible to overcome such weaknesses, otherwise he would have never succeeded in fusing time and space like he had, at least at the F grade. But the path toward doing so wasn't obvious. He wanted to use the Scorpion to elevate his Glassborn Christ Emperor gene class, and the Ape to elevate his Chaotic Sovereign gene class, raising up both to completely change the foundation of his physical and mental stats. But how? Abyssal Echo, ungraded, void class. When Scylla saw this pop up as a reward, and his only reward for that matter, he was a bit taken aback, and then uncaring. Disappointment would probably be a pretty common emotion to feel at this point, but he had received a good title from the dungeon, so it wasn't a complete loss. Obviously, he didn't have a third class slot, and he wasn't about to give up 2 legendary gene classes for a somewhat odd void class, whatever that was. One might think that this changed after he learned what a void class was and what Abyssal Echo could do in specific, but actually, he grew even less interested after the fact, especially since he couldn't seem to pass this void class on to someone else. A void class was more akin to a special constitution than a class. It didn't take up a class slot like other classes did, and as such, Scylla's didn't need to upgrade to a tri-class constitution to use it. Abyssal Echo was a fascinating void class because what it could essentially do was split the body in two, transposing the two halves to exist in the exact same frame of time and space, but at a separate frequency or dimension. Because of the way it worked, in exchange for halving the power of a class, one could give each of these two halves a class of their own, and essentially replicate a weaker version of the dual-class constitution. Depending on your time affinity, the nerfing of your two classes could be mitigated, but according to the little girl, reflecting about 80% of the class' original strength was about the peak of what you could do even with Scylla's talent in the matter. If Abyssal Echo had been a void class with both time and space aspects, then with Scylla's talent, he would be able to replicate 100% of the two classes' original strength. But unfortunately, Abyssal Cathedral was a pure time-based dungeon. Plus, 2 classes was the limit of Abyssal Echo, and Scylla's already had a dual-class constitution, making the void class worthless to him. Until he thought of the Crucible. Chapter 1430, Wasted Potential. Rather than feeding the void class into himself, Scylla's fed it directly into the Crucible. It didn't look like it had changed much after he did this, but Scylla's senses were beyond that of a normal person. While it looked like there was just one Crucible in his palm, he could practically feel them being superimposed onto one another. Scylla's gaze flashed. This will work. At that moment, the roaring menace of a Scorpion Emperor erupted from him. He tapped into the will so easily the world waned and flexed, his warlord will seemingly cowering away into the core of his body. This time, though, Silas wasn't drawing the Scorpion Emperor armor for himself. That wouldn't work, and he knew it wouldn't. The system had already created the gene for him once, and it wouldn't do it again. However, it would conveniently create it for a clone, now wouldn't it? Form. The moment Silas spoke the words, complex runes took shape in the air, weaving and wrapping around themselves until they shaped into a powerful momentum. At the same time, the legendary Ape Emperor gene sank into the crucible, while a familiar legendary Scorpion Emperor gene sank into it as well. The two played off of each other, rampaging before settling down into the two halves of the crucible. Somehow, the crucible almost seemed to dance in Silas' palm, colors of black, green, and red flickering out in all directions, sparking into emerald and black bolts of lightning. This is it, Silas thought. If you use it like that, you'll be wasting a lot of potential. More than I think I am already, Silas asked. Silas knew that by using the genes like this, he wouldn't be able to use the Emperor armors. His plan right now was to use these genes and the crucible to reforge his foundation. Essentially, he would elevate his actual stats a great deal, while losing the acute boost to his stats the armors would give. In addition, because he was using the Void class to make it work, the boosts would be far weaker than usual as well. Usually, the genes of the Warlord armors didn't give stat boosts, but the Emperor armor genes did. That said, even though they did, the boost was far less substantial than the actual boost given by the armors themselves. Using them in this way would increase the physical stat boosts given, and likely even improve his mental and will stats as well. But he would lose the ability to draw out the Emperor armors in the future. To Silas, this was worth it. He still had the Scorpion Warlord armor, and he couldn't use the Scorpion Emperor armor anyway, while using the Ape Emperor armor was far too dangerous. Plus, he had always had plans of creating his own unique armor in the future, and he was confident in his ability to succeed. But by the little girl's words, it seemed that he was still missing something. Think about what makes those armors as powerful as they are. Silas' eyes narrowed, coming to the answer instantly. Will. But he felt like it was a redundant step. He already had their wills and the comprehensions of them in his body. He had to draw them to perfection in the first place, so of course he already had 100% understanding of them. It didn't make sense for the little girl to be talking about wills. Why would he pour will into the crucible, only to absorb it back into his body when he already had the wills inside of him? Unless. Seeds. Silas' eyes narrowed. Could she be talking about the seeds? The Ape Emperor armor was even more like madness than the Warlord armor version of it was. If Silas could match it with a seed, the results would speak for themselves. But therein lay the same problem he was already fielding here. He already had seeds within his body. Why pour them into the crucible just to absorb them back once again? That didn't make sense. Which seemed to leave only one explanation. She was talking about seeds he didn't have. Silas frowned when he had this thought. This didn't make any sense either. The little girl had warned him about the trouble of having too many seeds, only to tell him to go and get more. Something wasn't adding up here for sure. Suddenly Silas' eyes blazed like torches. The will that was missing here wasn't an external source. It was his own. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. This conclusion seemed to have the same problem as all the others. His own will was more himself than any of the others, so why pour it out, then absorb it again? That was because something would have to fundamentally change about the crucible in regard to his will first. His perfect spark seed. Under normal circumstances, if he absorbed the Void class, then it would be limited in what it could do. However, the crucible was an experimental ground. What if he tried to use his Archon casting to manipulate and change the Void class such that it could show more spatial aspects? In that case, he would be able to retain more of the stat points and gain much more from integrating the crucible. In his own body, the process would be too complex and it would be easy to make a mistake. But with the crucible, Silas' eyes flashed practically bright gold. He lost himself. A day. 2. A week. However, he only seemed to grow more focused as time went on, his body having been hooked up to Andromeda at some unknown time. And then, something seemed to crack. At first it seemed as though Silas had pushed it too far, like he had destroyed the crucible. However, the cold indifference on his expression painted a completely different picture. Success. The crucible seemed to well and truly become one, a rippling aura spreading out in all directions. With a thought, Silas grasped the crucible, pressing it into his chest. In that instant, it melted, fusing into the layers of his body. Silas trembled once, and then his frame lit on fire. Chapter 1431. Superimposed. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human Semioid D. Affiliation: Legacy 7777, Progenitor of Earth, Golden Grove Elder, Beast Warlord Sanctum 073, Class: Glassborn Christ Emperor, Legendary, F. Class: Chaotic Sovereign, Legendary, F. Profession: Vipermancer, Bronze, E. Profession: Runeweaver, EEE+. Level: 50. Coins: 837,111,132,382, F, 8212,261, E, 1232, D. Titles: A Marked Will, Milky Way Progeny, Progenitor Grandmaster, Palms of Fate, System Rebel, Sacred Tamer, Skill Progenitor. Physical: 53,000. Greater than Strength: 53,000. Greater than Constitution: 53,000. Greater than Dexterity: 53,000. Greater than Speed: 53,000. Mental: 237,066. Greater than Intelligence: 290,809. Greater than Wisdom: 320,389. Greater than Charisma: 100,000. Wool: 100,000. Luck: 11. Skills: Gene Skills, Cryobane Elevation, F, Suppressive Scouting, FFF+. Gene Class Form, Primal Step, FFF+, Primal Gut, FFF+, Glassvolt Prism Arts, FFF+, Chaotic Menace, FFF+, Glassvolt Shift, FFF+, Gene Class Harmony, Chaos Form, FFF+, Christ Emperor Form, FFF+. Growth Skills, Madness Control, F, Primal Fury, FFF+, Glassvolt Throne, FFF+, Comprehensions, Glassvolt, FFF, Madness, Bronze, F, Mixed Demonic Arts, Bronze, F. Gene State, Malleable. Fragmented Genes, Voice of a King, F. Common Genes. Bronze Genes. Silver Genes. Gold Genes, Emerald Scorpion, F. Chaotic Ape, F. Legendary Genes, Empty, Empty. Elevated Gene Talents, Etherborn Will, Common. Silas looked at his status screen for a long while. To say that these stats were broken compared to what he had once been was an enormous understatement. And his mental stats. He knew that they were only so high because of Dominus Paragon, but even so. Having six-figure stats as an F tier. Silas looked down at his hands, squeezing and unsqueezing them. To his eyes, his skin seemed to glisten. He had already felt nigh untouchable at the F tier because his stats became so ridiculous. How much more powerful was he now? This still isn't enough to become a C-grade race. Once I become a C-grade human semioid, would my stats increase even further? There was a reason Silas was so insistent on wanting to go to this Empyrean dungeon. It wasn't just the fact that he was curious, but because the map to the obelisks happened to line up with this dungeon as well. Silas hadn't noticed at first until he was thinking about whether he'd have time to do both, and he realized the warning pings his luck was giving him for the two were near identical. The danger for the obelisks was just the slightest touch more dangerous. But the fact that they were so close made Silas wonder if it was a coincidence or not. When he actually learned of where the Empyrean dungeon was, and lined it up with the direction the maps were pointing him in, he realized that they were, indeed, one-to-one. Whatever this champion dungeon was, it was related to the obelisks and a chance to improve his race. And right now, Silas felt the importance of such a thing more than ever. Somehow, despite how shocking his stats were, he didn't really well and truly feel like his stats had improved by almost an entire magnitude. Of course, he still felt like he had grown several times stronger, but not enough to justify such a stat jump. If Silas was correct, what made his stats feel almost empty was their lack of effectiveness, effectiveness he was lacking because his race was too low. He had finally reached a point where his talent couldn't make up for his low starting position. But it was a good thing, then, that he had a solution to that problem looming. As for the problem of his stats effectiveness, in an acute sense, he could fix that even without the obelisks. After all, his perfect spark mastery was like an unfathomable abyss of potential. There were many things he simply couldn't do with it because his body was too weak. For example, before, even having 100 foundation ether to use was impossible. He had felt like his body would explode. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. But now, he had 2 of them. How much further could he push his combat matrix index now? Even if his stats were hollow, he could forcefully give them substance with his runes. By the time his stats were no longer such empty numbers, and his combat matrix index became truly additive, or even exponential, he'd be a true monster. And this was exactly what he needed to be if he wanted to keep Primus Imperium when moving into the E tier. This was his path to his revenge. When the day came he met that father-son pair again, he would have long grown past the need for that legendary gene, maybe he might even choose to destroy it. But that would be his choice. No one had the right to take his things. Silas swept a hand across the air and his lab became a training room. Now, it was time for him to grow used to this new body and maybe finally get his skills up to common mastery. It had been too long, and dragging his feet with mere fragmented mastery skills was unbecoming of his current status. A Primus Imperium with such low mastery stats was its own humiliation. And right now, he had time to fix it. The Champion Arena, Empyrean, level maximum, 50, recommended. Entry limit, N.A., description, N.A., war points, 1,150,100. Hustle and bustle around dungeons was nothing new or rare. However, there was something particularly somber about this atmosphere, the sort of silent ambience reminiscent of a funeral more than anything else. The Abridged sector was one of the few with an Empyrean dungeon, and by rights, it should be one of the most frequently visited as a result. But it didn't seem as though there were as many tourists here as there should have been for such a high-level dungeon. And that was because this was no normal dungeon, it was no normal Empyrean dungeon either. It was a combination dungeon, a singular dungeon with many entrances dotted across the universe, all of which shared the same name. The Champion Arena. Chapter 1432, The Champion Arena. The pain was unbearable. It seemed that there was a reason it was called a crucible. The integration process was quite literally searing the changes into the body, burning away former impurities or clashing aspects, and reforging them in a new light. It was like tossing the body into a forge. But Silas quickly realized that this was the wrong way to think of it. A crucible was what was tossed into a forge. In this case, his body had suddenly become the forge of the crucible itself, and the heat he could withstand, the pain he could endure, became what decided how well the crucible was integrated into his body. Silas looked down at himself as his clothing was burned away, his charred pieces of flesh beginning to curl and bubble. It was a sight one would have found sickening even if observing it on another, let alone yourself. But Silas simply stood there. He could feel the pain, but it was almost as though it was a third party experiencing it, like he was communicating with his own senses through some sort of large communication channel rather than the signals being turned to his own brain. His will was too powerful to be moved by this level of pain. The crucible was a treasure Silas didn't know the grade of, but the changes it triggered were all dependent on the tier of the person using it. Silas was an F tier, his body was triggering changes to an F tier foundation, and yet his will was already that of the E tier. More. The flames around Silas' body blazed to life. As though a spurting faucet had finally been turned on to full bore, his skin practically flaked off of him in a rain of ash, only to be buried and hidden beneath the heat of the flames. At first, the flames themselves were normal, flickering in red and orange hues. But quickly, they condensed, becoming an incandescent blue, and then a vicious green that perfectly melded with Silas' will. Silas' gaze flickered beneath the flames, feeling something curious. With a thought, he tapped into Taboo Bond and began to guide the melting crucible with greater accuracy. At that moment, the flames became even wilder as the energy the crucible was using to maneuver through the layers of Silas' body became as easy to swim through as soft winds. It wasn't just that, but because of taboo bond, Silas was actually able to allow the crucible to sink in deeper than it normally would. Taboo bond was now an E-grade legendary profession path, but even when it was at F grade, Silas had already been able to touch the absolute deepest layers there were. Potential. The crucible alone could only make it as deep as race quintessence. And the deeper it went, the more energy it wasted on this instead of actually transforming the body. But not only could Silas make it to the free chaos layer of his body, he could make it to the lowest and most difficult to comprehend layer, potential. As a result, saying the crucible was doubly effective on him didn't do it justice. It was several orders of magnitude more effective. Not only was it saving a ridiculous amount of its energy thanks to Silas' help, but it was making it to layers deeper than most who ever used it. Silas could feel his body rapidly changing, morphing and twisting about so quickly that every second he felt like he was being reborn again and again. It was an intoxicating feeling, the sort that poured into your veins like a drug you simply couldn't get enough of. The first time Silas had felt this sort of thirst for evolution was in the Basilisk dungeon. Since then, he had experienced it many more times. And yet, this was by far the best of them all. Silas raised his head to the ceiling, his arms opening out wide as he breathed slowly, not even caring about the emerald flames pouring into his stomach. The crucible had so much excess energy because of taboo bond that it didn't even have a place to direct it. So Silas obliged, taking it for himself. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. Splitting his mind another way, he activated Primal Gut, churning the flaming energy away into one purpose. Expanding his ether pathways. He burned them away and reforged them using the unique flames of the crucible, and then burned them away again, only to repeat the process. His intelligence was so shockingly high for his tier, but he simply couldn't make use of it. He wielded one of the strongest F-grade ethers in all of existence, and yet he felt like he could only make use of a fraction of its power. It wasn't good enough. In fact, having just one of them wasn't good enough. Silas' 100 Foundation Glassvault rune sparked to life, but soon after came the second 100 Foundation rune that Silas had created. This rune carried the menace of destruction and space to it. Though Silas' Glassvault rune had both aspects of time and space, those aspects had been muted in favor of its poisonous characteristics and its ability to attack will. And, it was more defensive than anything else too, with how it could forge and create crystal barriers. It had become more of an auxiliary ability than Silas wanted. So this time, when he perfected the Ape Emperor armor, he wanted an ether that was pure wrath, an attacking ether that could rip everything in its path to shreds. Silas had no need for a void class that could double his classes. But what if he used the crucible to double his ether pathways instead? He shattered his ether pathways once again, and with a flicker, two were superimposed onto one another, blooming with poison and destruction. One shimmered like it was chiseled out of emerald gems and the other glistened as though carved from obsidian. Abyssal Echo Ether Pathways. On one side, there was his 100 Foundation Glassvault rune. Superimposed onto it was his 100 Foundation Chaotic Space rune. Silas' eyes flashed open as all the flames billowing across his body vanished at once. Chapter 1433, Noisy. Silas stepped off of the vessel, the rush of hot air and countless gazes sizing him and those that followed him not bothering him in the slightest. There was a density to Silas' aura now that made the pupils of many constrict. Senses that swept by felt like they were falling into an abyss. Even before, even E-tiers couldn't see through Silas' stats. By now, it was even more impossible for them to do so, and it was unlikely that he would run into a D-tier anytime soon capable of it. Of course, the reason for that was because the sector he was born in was too weak, while this Empyrean dungeon only had two characters. F-tiers and the C-tiers that came to protect them. Another come to spend years waiting. The muttering caught Silas' attention and his gaze flickered. He certainly didn't plan on spending years here. From the minimal information he managed to pick up on the way here, the Empyrean dungeon had a waitlist too, but that was par for the course for any dungeon. However, there was nothing about having to sit around waiting for so long. If there was something like that, Silas was sure that it would have been explained or even hinted at. Which meant, an unspoken rule of some sort. Something most don't find out until they actually go there themselves for the first time. Either way, Silas had no intention of waiting so long. If there really was something he couldn't buck up against, then he would just go and deal with his matters in the Milky Way galaxy and then save this for later. After all, there was still years between now and when the Sanctum would go off to compete. He had time. Silas wasn't in a hurry to move forward just yet, though. He looked over toward the one who had spoken, a red-skinned man with goggles fitted over his eyes. They flickered with runes as though they were trying to analyze Silas. Some people were quite bold like this, while others were far more reserved. It was easy to decipher between them. Those like the red-skinned man were confident in their backing and abilities, and those that were reserved preferred not to poke at any wasp nests. As expected, the red-skinned man didn't avoid Silas' gaze. He met them calmly and seemed to be using Silas' eyes like some sort of window into his body. In fact, Silas could feel that maybe the man had said those words purposely so that Silas would hear him and look over. Chi. The lens of the man's goggles cracked and he stumbled back, being caught by his companions. He hurried to pull his goggles off, looking at the damage with an ugly expression on his face. Silas waved a hand and the goggles were ripped out of the man's hands before he could react. He hadn't exactly been holding them firmly to begin with. Because they were damaged, he was only allowing them to rest in his palms. It didn't take Silas more than a glance to understand what he was seeing. Then, with a flex of his forearm and squeeze of his fingers, he shattered it to pieces, letting it fall to the ground. He took a step forward and crushed them into the dusty ground. The world around them was quite barren, almost like the surface of Earth's moon. Dusted and grey, there was a large archway up ahead that carried what seemed like the portal to the Empyrean dungeon, and a large stone slab to the side that had what seemed to be the waiting list. The groups of ships were the largest sign of life. Well, that and the few shacks in the surroundings that had some merchant guilds trying to take advantage of the long waiting times. It was clever enough. You. Heralds. The red-skinned man's companion pulled him back. Let go of me. Do you know how much I spent on those? Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. And you think it's a coincidence they cracked? Think. Herald's companion practically poked a hole through his skull with a finger. Herald just slapped his hand away, though. No, you think. I can't even remember the last time I saw an F tier that weak, and he's followed by 2 of them. That C tier has a foot in the grave and I could feel that my Ura lens was just a half measure from seeing through him too. You think he has a powerful background? Fuck you. That ship is a Frankenstein of parts. No self-respecting person of any decent strength would ride in that thing. Pushing his friend away, Herald rushed at Silas who was simply walking toward the stone monument in the distance. Without another word, he was already throwing a fist. The ether it passed through crackled almost like a meteor was jetting through it. Boom. Before Herald's fist could land, he found himself tipping forward, a strong telekinesis pressing down on his fist from above and sending all his momentum into the ground. Silas turned back to find Herald buried shoulder deep in an almost impressively tiny hole of his own making. He raised his foot and pressed it onto his head, Herald's screams echoing as he felt his skull deform. He could feel that Silas wasn't using anything but his telekinesis and physical stats. How could he deform a body as powerful as his own so casually and without gathering the slightest hint of momentum first? Stop. A booming voice came from a distant ship, but Silas didn't seem to hear it. Herald's screams became more harrowing, grating against the bone as blood began to ooze from his ears. His face could no longer be seen, firmly planted into the ground, but the slow deformation of his head was enough to make a person's skin crawl. Old Brammer's eyes narrowed as he felt an aura rapidly approaching from the distance. He clicked a button on his wrist and pointed it at their ship. The top opened to reveal a cannon that began rapidly accumulating ether. Why is it so noisy? The voice made Silas' foot pause. It was so calm, and not very loud, but the power. Chapter 1434, Milky Way Horizon. The cannon seemed to wink out, and the aura blazing over from a distance came to a stop. The voice never appeared, and their question was only rhetorical, and yet it seemed to stop everything. There was no need for a warning, no need for a reprimand. In fact, he had already disappeared by the time the last of its words echoed, as though it already knew what the result would be the moment it spoke. Silas looked up to the skies for a long while, before his gaze shifted, landing on an inconspicuous shape in the distance. It looked like 3 blocks of black rectangular prisms stacked together, one lengthwise and the other 2 across its width. Of the latter 2, one was stacked near the front and across the top, while the latter was stacked near the back and across the bottom. It didn't look like it followed any sort of aerodynamic physics at all, and yet Silas came to a shocking realization. Until the moment he had looked for it, he hadn't realized that ship was there at all. And no matter how long he stared at it, his depth perception couldn't pinpoint whether it was an arm's length away, or a moon's length away. After a while, he removed his foot from Herola's head, looking up to the sea tier that had been blazing a path forward to protect his charge. He, too, was red-skinned and carried a pair of goggles with him. However, it was clear that despite his strength, he didn't dare to go against that voice either. Was that really a sea tier? Silas wondered to himself, but he didn't glance back at Herol's as he continued his walk toward the stone in the distance. In the depths of a ship, a middle-aged man slowly opened his eyes. He looked completely and utterly human except for one thing. The whites of his eyes were painted black, his irises flickering with a crimson light. He found me. The middle-aged man tilted his head to the side for a moment before he shook his head. No, Silas didn't find him. He found the ship. Not nearly as impressive, but shocking nonetheless since he didn't know what he was looking for. Silas then deduced that it was highly likely the voice had come from here. How fascinating. I wonder if I should let him into this round or if I should observe some more. The middle-aged man's eyes flickered as he saw something. Silas had certainly gotten much better at hiding it, but the eyes of the middle-aged man couldn't be as easily fooled as others. Unprotected royal line, but I can't see the exact grade. How fascinating. His will can hide things from me. Or is it a treasure of some sort? After making a mistake once, Silas would be highly unlikely to commit it again. The important people there that day had all died, slaughtered either by Silas or old Brammer himself, while everyone else were lower commoners. Of course, they could still spread the information, but no one knew who Silas Grimblade even was back then, and there was no way to identify him. After that, Silas had found a method to hide it, half relying on his will, and another half relying on the scorned raps. What the scorned raps did best was break the rules of the system, and the royal line was something gifted by the system. Silas was able to more or less use the scorned raps to separate himself from his royal line a bit, making it seem as though it wasn't truly a part of him and making it much harder to detect. After the system announced Silas had a royal hero line, the connection was still not made because no one would assume it was unprotected. Unprotected genes and lines were unheard of even in the Milky Way sector. And yet, it couldn't escape this man's senses. Silas' intuition was right after all. He was no C tier. Silas felt an uncomfortable itch on the back of his neck as though he was being observed, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. However, he had a more than good enough guess. Why this person was still observing him, he didn't know. But he also didn't like it. Would you like to register for the next opening? Yes, no. Silas' gaze flickered. Yes. There was a whir and then something odd appeared. Entry requirements. Race, C+, sector, Grade 1 Gold, stats, 20,000 physical, 20,000 mental. What's a C+ race? It didn't seem like the nomenclature the system used at all. Until Silas understood. This wasn't the nomenclature of the system in the first place. It was something put here by others. Silas pressed a hand forward when he understood this. The scorned raps, having been hidden from view for a long while now, suddenly returned. Chi. The planet rumbled as though those watching the scene from afar were alerted to what was going on. However, it was already too late. The system, prompt shattered to pieces, burned to ash by the presence of the scorned raps. Would you like to register for the next opening? Yes, no. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. Yes. You are the first to register and have the right to immediately challenge for champion. Would you like to? Yes, no. Silas raised an eyebrow. It seemed that whatever he had done had erased the entire waiting list that came before him. But then there was a blinding flash of red light. Primus Imperium detected. The question was wiped away before Silas even got the chance to ask. his Primus Imperium crown appeared above his head in the form of a ring of broken, bloodied swords. The red pillar of light only became more crimson. Welcome, champion of the Milky Way horizon. Empyrean-wide announcement. Your champion has been selected. There are 11 slots remaining to be filled. Challenge for the position of champion or the position of knight, time remaining, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Chapter 1435. No mistake. Silas looked at the notification screen quite calmly. The crimson pillar of light before him suddenly expanded, swallowing him whole and then increasing its range even further beyond. As the pillar expanded, the color grew more translucent, until it became a dome that protected the region. Even those that had been near Silas just moments ago were pushed away, forced to retreat until they opened up a space that was kilometers wide. Silas took a breath and exhaled. With a shake of his head, he pulled his trench coat off, folding it with meticulous sweeps of his arms and hands. Once he was finished, he put it away in a spatial ring and began to roll up his sleeves, unbuttoning the wrists and carefully folding them once, twice, then thrice. It seemed that his time here had become significantly more annoying. The middle-aged man slowly stood to his feet, his eyes as bright as torches. The champion title shouldn't just be handed down like that. But even before he got to that problem, there was the fact Silas had so easily shattered the system they put in place. Silas had been right. They had added a filter of sorts. Normally, the way the dungeon worked was much the same as all of them did, first come, first serve. Whichever group of 12 arrived first would become the pull to enter, and the champion would be decided amongst them. Of course, if they couldn't meet the bare minimum requirement to be a knight or champion, they would be killed and the process would continue like this. The trouble was that no one wanted to wait around for people who weren't worthy to take one test after another. So instead, the powerhouse factions that came here had a filtration system. Unless you were of a certain talent and background level, you couldn't even reach the real system requirements. Silas had somehow destroyed that system. But that was when the true shocking aspects of what happened shook him. The system, the real system, the system that they all practically worshipped, chasing after the affirmation and rewards of. The system that upheld the entire universe. It deemed it was entirely unnecessary to test Silas. In fact, it welcomed them to try and prove it wrong, not caring if they believed its words or not. Primus Imperium. This was the only time the system would make such a decision. Many believed the Primus Imperium title to be some sort of blessing, a reward to be chased and lusted after. But those people were naive. It was said that in the past, the legendary system had the hero line. To whom much was given, much was expected. Those given the hero line were expected to give far more to the legendary system in return. The current system didn't have such a comprehensive method. But if one were to point out what its hero line was, it was this conquest title. Every time the system manipulated things for the sake of its Primus Imperium, it was pushing them right into the burning coals of hell. It was goading everyone present to prove it wrong, not because it was so confident, but because it wanted its chosen to prove why it should be confident. The middle-aged man suddenly waved a hand. A young man wearing a kilted skirt and plated leather armor was suddenly revealed. A hand formed of fog, gripping him before he soared out of the ship of 3 black blocks. The middle-aged man had hardly caught him when he was forced to wave his other hand, catching yet another young man. The two looked like brothers, and that was because they were, though the second was far skinnier and a small bit younger than the first. Not every insult needs a response, and patience doesn't always mean weakness or fear. Until I sense real calm from the two of you, don't think to step out even for a moment. The middle-aged man waved his hands again and they were violently thrown back into their rooms. There was a flicker in the blacks of the middle-aged man's eyes and countless sealing runes appeared on the doors, locking them in place. Then, the world seemed to warp. With a whoosh, the vision of the man turned to black once again. It was like he had transposed himself into a completely different reality, whereas his real self never actually moved a single inch in the first place. If Silas had been here, he would have recognized what he was seeing instantly. Spatial casting. This man wasn't just AB tier, he was AB tier with a rune mastery that was far from simple. Slowly, the middle-aged man sat back into his seat, leaning his elbow on his armrest and leaning his cheek onto a fist. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. Now, why is your aura so weak as a Primus Imperium? What makes you worthy of such an evaluation by the system? There were very few who dared to call the system impotent. Those existences blinked stars out of existence with single breaths. To the vast majority of the universe, the system was infallible. Including to this middle-aged man. The system could be manipulated, but everyone knew to skirt the edges and hope its wrath didn't fall upon you. The death of a demigod Thriskai clan spoke that truth in spades. So never once did Elder Nocturus believe the system was wrong. What he wanted to know was what Silas was hiding. Silas didn't look up as he sensed one ship after another trembling. However, it was a young man with red skin and a familiar, and yet unfamiliar, pair of goggles that made it first. Name, Duskveir, level, 50. Physical, 23,111, mental, 32,389, will, 29,838. This young man was clearly the strongest of the group. Having gained a chance for revenge, the choice seemed obvious. However, he actually didn't target Silas like one might expect. Instead, he immediately clicked yes when prompted by the system, choosing to challenge a knight position. Rage filled his belly, though, when he noticed that Silas hadn't looked up to meet his gaze in the first place. Silas didn't seem to care whether he challenged him or not. Chapter 1436, Nyara Saloon. This isn't going to end well, is it? Alex mumbled. Jalla looked at Alex, a hint of confusion between his brows. After all that talk about trusting Silas and never doubting him, where were these words coming from? Don't look at me like that. I'm not talking about him, I'm talking about us. That barrier isn't going to protect us, now is it? The realization hit Jalla, his jaw clenching. Dusk reached up, pulling his goggles over his eyes as a shimmering humanoid of ether appeared before him. He spread his arms out like he was conducting an orchestra, and all of a sudden it was like all the runes in the world came to obey his commands, forming a series of formations that looked like machine guns. The guns pulsed to life and began to rotate. The rapid fire was almost too low in volume for the destruction they were ripping across the world. The knight formed of ether brandished a shield, blocking this oncoming assault and taking a sharp step to the side. It seemed as though it had practically teleported, its body appearing over a dozen meters away. It should have taken Dusk just a single step to turn and cover the change, however the knight was somehow faster than even this step. Dusk's eyes narrowed as the knight's shield seemed to become the sheath of a great sword. Though it didn't change size or shape, a blade was pulled out from behind it, appearing at Dusk's neck in a flashing instant. In the moment of life and death, there was a slight twirl of light in the depth of Dusk's goggles' right lens, the twinkle causing the machine guns to warp and collapse into one another. Silas felt something odd, looking up at Dusk for the first time. That, just now, it felt a lot like his weaving irises, and yet not at the same time. He just combined a large number of runes into one as though he had always drawn them that way. Silas hadn't forgotten that he had gained his runeweaver profession from the well wishes of a powerhouse. He still didn't know who this powerhouse was or where they were from, but he had been looking out for information. But no, it isn't the same. The version of the runeweaver profession Silas had was a weakened version because he refused the full inheritance. He had enough problems to deal with without having another monstrous existence he didn't understand breathing down his neck. He had a feeling that it was because he had this weakened version that what he felt was even remotely close. If he had the full profession, maybe he would think it funny to even compare them. Still, Silas was curious. The fact they had some overlap was worth investigating. He had the profession, and the eyes, but the methods in which he used them were still too limited. Plus, it was a bit annoying he had to wear these sunglasses everywhere. He wasn't usually a fan of eyewear under normal circumstances. The knight was blocked by the sudden change, the guns morphing into a shield, and then into arms that wrapped the projection up and held it in place. Chi, chi, chi. The sound of skewering echoed through the silence as Dusk pulled out a gun of rotating gears from his side holster. Pointing it at the head of the trapped knight, he looked up towards Silas once again. But by this point, Silas had once more stopped paying attention. Dusk sneered and pulled the trigger, a flaming hole appearing in the head of the knight. Slowly, his runes were retracted and the knight fell to the ground, the exit wound of the blazing laser landing before Scylla's feet. But once again, Scylla didn't seem to have noticed. Dusk didn't get a chance to say a word before another hand touched the barrier. It seemed that everyone was hurrying to claim the dozen spots. There was simply no time to deal with Scylla's first. They had been waiting for the perfect team to be assembled, but if they weren't going to get that chance, they didn't want to be left holding the bag. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. This time, it was a woman who succeeded. She had the most complex complexion Scylla's had ever seen. It was a brown so dark and rich it almost seemed black, but lines of gold forming either perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal layered on top of it. It looked like these lines were tattooed on her after birth, most of them just barely elevated like a freshly pressed etching or burn. But Scylla could tell that these weren't added after the fact. This was her real skin. She had a beauty that came with this skin that was hard to describe. Unconventional and exotic to most, but captivating regardless of the audience. The transition between her skin and clothing wasn't very obvious either. It was hard to tell if she was wearing clothes at all if not for the distinct lack of obvious genitals. Whatever was covering her carried the very same deep, dark richness and golden lines, while not having the slightest apparent seam. Her style of battle was just as seamless. She wielded a twin pair of golden katanas, each so long they dwarfed her body in height. The knight was sliced to ribbons the instant it appeared, and the smile on Dusk's face couldn't help but fade as a result. Name: Nyora Saloon, Level, 50. Physical, 43,288, Mental, 21,333, Will, 41,111. Her steps paused and she looked towards Scylla's, her eyes narrowing. She could feel herself having been scanned just now, that uncomfortable feeling of being seen through by someone else. However, after a long pause, she said nothing more. Another member of Nyaра's race took the third position, and the fourth, before another group managed to wedge themselves in. Everything continued swiftly and in the blink of an eye, the 11 spots were filled. But it was only obvious that many wouldn't be satisfied, and the timer still had well more than 23 hours on it. Chapter 1437, Veil. Dusk frowned. He had been able to make it into one of the 12 mostly out of luck. Because of the conflict between Scylla and his teammate, he had already been near the portal. However, he felt like he was one of the weakest here aside from Scylla himself, and yet no one seemed eager to challenge Scylla. Was it really because there was still so much time left? The more Dusk thought about it, the more natural it seemed. Gaining the champion title now would be like putting a huge target on your back. There was no need to place such a burden on yourself so early. But that was a problem for Dusk. If he was the weakest knight, and Scylla's champion status protected him for the time being, it meant that the first person to be targeted wouldn't be Scylla. It would be him. A cold sweat began to form on Dusk's back. The knight projections, he could deal with. They were powerful, but their effectiveness was limited and their intelligence wasn't great. These people, however. Just as Dusk was wondering if he should take the risk and challenge Scylla first, there was a change. Nyara slowly walked forward until she stood before Scylla. Compared to everyone else who looked like they were ready to step onto a battlefield at any time, Scylla looked like he had just finished a long day at the office and was getting ready to unwind at a bar with an ice-cold beer. The look would have been perfect, from the black slacks to the white dress shirt with rolled-up sleeves, even the casual way he placed his hands into his pockets. But there was a catch. That being the fact his scorned wraps were visible and covered in bloody marks, while his hair. It was the hair of a wild man, carrying heavy curls that the wind seemed too weak to shift. Nyara's twin golden katanas rested on her back, her eyes calm as she stood barely a meter from Scylla's. At their strength, even 10 meters might as well have been nose to nose. For her to be this close, invading Scylla's personal space, it seemed obvious she wanted something more than just a chat. "Who are you?" she asked coldly. Scylla looked back at her, seemingly not caring to respond. "If you'd like to not answer, that's fine too. It just means I'll have to take the risk to fight you." Scylla still didn't respond and Nyara's eyes couldn't help but narrow. Unlike the rest of her body, her eyes were quite human, carrying normal whites. but her irises were like burning amber flames, dancing with a battle intent that was hard to describe. Her wool itself also took on this color, reminding one of the ambrosia of the gods, at least, how fairy tales would describe it. Shiiing. Nyara unsheathed one of her golden katanas off to the side. With a twist of her wrist, it spun, leaving a thin gash across the earth beneath them, angled toward her back. She caught the long hilt of her blade and Scylla's notification screen flashed with warnings. Challenge issued. Knight Nyara Saloon is dissatisfied with your rule. Accept this challenge. Yes, no. Scylla's looked at this screen for a short while. Why was it giving him a choice to accept or reject? It felt odd. This didn't seem like the sort of thing he should have an option with in the first place. Yes. Nyara felt an odd restriction that had been on her moments ago vanish. However, she didn't move, wariness and confusion coloring her features. Why hadn't she been able to attack immediately just now? What was going on? Knight Nyara Saloon accepts her defeat. Do you accept? Yes, no. Updated first on LIGHTNOVELWORLD.org. Scylla's gaze flickered this time. She gave up. Just like that. Interesting. Nyara tossed her katana into the air as the result was announced, her blade churning up what felt like hurricane force winds until it fell and slotted itself back into its sheath. Without a word, she turned around and returned to her people, her expression hard to read aside from the furrow in her brow. From time to time, she looked towards Scylla's, but she didn't try to challenge him again. The odd interaction left those present not really knowing what to do. Even Scylla's wasn't expecting such a thing. He wondered if Nyara's luck was just that high. To the side, Dusk was speechless, feeling out of place and like he might easily become the target again. Why hadn't things gone the way they should have? After the odd interaction, there seemed to be an invisible film of invincibility around Scylla's, and even fewer were looking toward him, while more were beginning to look toward Dusk. Of the 11, 3 were Nyara and her race, then there were another 2 groups of 3, followed by Dusk and 1 more loner. The lunar race was Nyara's people, then came the Enlor race and the Revolt race. And that loner, Dusk didn't know who he was, but his mystery was completely overshadowed by Scylla's, and his aura wasn't anything to mess with, leaving Dusk as the odd man out. Just as Dusk was about to fold under the pressure, the hours beginning to tick by with no sign of movement from anyone else, there was another change that saved him. The ship of 3 blocks shook and a pair of young men stepped out of it. The timer had ticked down to less than 12 hours remaining, and many were beginning to grow restless. But whatever restlessness there was came to a grinding halt when they saw this pair of young men. Nyara subconsciously reached for her katana, her heart beating out of her chest. The human race was the most abundant race across the cosmos, but they were also among the weakest. The few humans capable of shedding that weakness tended to be in a league all their own. These 2 were certainly human, but they were no normal humans. They were the Veil human race, a B-grade race that had conquered an entire horizon. Why would they appear in a horizon that wasn't their own? Chapter 1438. Change. Name, Krasil Veil. Level, 50. Physical, 78,472. Mental, 85,091. Wool, 90,918. Veric Veil. Level, 50. Physical, 82,332. Mental, 82,991. Wool, 92,998. The pair of brothers walked forward, the armors reminding Scylla's of something between a cross of ancient Greece and ancient Scotland. The pleated skirts they wore seemed somehow both fabric and metallic at the same time, making the sounds of the latter while carrying the flexibility of the former. Their leather-plated armor was etched with muscles one could be sure they had in earnest beneath, while the gazes looked ahead with a cool indifference. This time, Scylla's was paying attention. In fact, he was paying very close attention. This wasn't entirely due to the voice that had spoken earlier, but these 2. They were extraordinarily powerful. Scylla's never cared much for stats. Ever since his time in the Split Realm, he had grown fond of using his will to suss out the power of people. He was the perfect example of why stats were so meaningless. Back when his stats were practically inferior to everyone he came across, he defeated them nonetheless. And now his stats were superior to almost everyone in the F tier he came across, until now, apparently, but they felt far more empty than they ever had before. But these two, not only were their stats absolutely ridiculous, but they had a deep well of substance behind them. No matter which of the two it was, Silas knew that it would be a battle that brought him to the brink. Regardless of which of the others it had been, Silas felt like he would hardly have to lift a finger, even for Nyara. But this pair of brothers. That man was, indeed, a B tier. And these two, just might be of a B grade race. Krasil, the lankier of the two, looked to the side, sizing up Brahma, Jala, and Alex. The trio had made themselves small a long while ago, but the Veil human seemed able to see through the one-way glass of their ship with ease. He really is human, Krasil said after a long while. Two of his companions are human, though one is a Runatawa. Different strains of human, though. Which makes it curious, the bulkier Veric replied calmly. He carries the aura of an ape, the one with dark ether seems some inferior, weak strain of human, while the one wearing white armor is another weak strain of human, though slightly better. They don't seem related at all. In this corner of the universe, powerful humans are rare. Maybe they like to band together. As the two spoke, they never slowed their feet, and soon, they had reached the barrier. Do you want to go first, or should I? Different strains of human, though. Which makes it curious, the bulkier Veric replied calmly. He carries the aura of an ape, the one with dark ether seems some inferior, weak strain of human, while the one wearing white armor is another weak strain of human, though slightly better. They don't seem related at all. In this corner of the universe, powerful humans are rare. Maybe they like to band together. As the two spoke, they never slowed their feet, and soon, they had reached the barrier. Do you want to go first, or should I? Are you going to challenge him? Uncle doesn't seem to want us to. Yes, but I'm asking you. Veric fell into silence upon hearing the question asked of him a second time. His gaze landed on Silas, who was calmly looking right back at him. Did you feel him? Veric asked Krasil. I did. His will is stronger than ours. But his other stats are either limited or vapid. He seems confident, though. The two spoke as though they didn't care if Silas could hear their words or not, almost like they were looking at a show horse up for sale, examining him from all sides. If I was a Primus Imperium, I'd be confident too. There's a thin line between confidence and arrogance. You see, the difference between us and him. Is that you're here because you're too weak to cut it in your own horizon, Silas spoke slowly. The two brothers were already looking at Silas, and nothing changed in the silence that fell between them after he spoke those words. You don't know what the champion arena is, do you? Veric said after a long while. Maybe that's a little impressive, considering how far you've made it while being so ignorant. No, we aren't here because we are too weak in our own horizon. We're here because it's more convenient. Those who enter the champion arena expecting to rely on a team have already lost. Oh, are you planning on telling him? Veric raised an eyebrow, surprised Krasil was saying so much. I'm just a little bit curious. Maybe he knows something we don't. After all, for him to make it so far, there has to be at least a little bit of a reason for it. A give and take, then. A give and take, Krasil confirmed. After he insulted you, Veric asked with a smile. You mean us? Veric picked at his ears. I don't think I heard that part. Could have sworn it was just you. That lanky frame does nothing but embarrass me wherever it goes. If you want to fight, we can do that. Krasil didn't wait for Veric's reply, though. The champion arena is a winner-takes-all event. There are 3 segments, the knight portion, the champion portion, and the team portion. Only one portion really needs to perform well to unlock the upper levels of the tower, but you never know who you're going to come across, so it's better not to put all your eggs in one basket. None of that refutes my words, Silas replied. Krasil's smile became more dangerous. Doesn't it? Champion versus knight is more like seeding than anything else. It's a matter of convenience, not necessity. If you perform poorly, I could just as easily take your champion title away from you in there as I could here. But maybe that doesn't refute things for you either. Instead, I think it's just about time you pay me back for some of this information I'm giving you and answer your doubts at the same time, no. Krasil and Veric's gazes both became more intent. In truth, we're only here by coincidence because we noticed something peculiar. The system has never acted so wildly and arbitrarily before, so maybe only a few here might know what's going on. Tell us, why did the system suddenly start calling this the Milky Way horizon all of a sudden? Who changed the name? Or why was it changed? Scylla's heart stopped beating entirely, a flashbang echoing through his mind. Chapter 1439, Masquerade. It was a question that had been lingering in Scylla's mind for a while, one that he didn't have an answer to. However, what he did know was the trigger point. The Milky Way galaxy was once known as the Sky Galaxy. There was a number attached to it as well, but that was all but irrelevant at the moment. After the all-seeing eye appeared, the manifestation of the legendary system triggered by an item of the Professors of Legacy, things changed. After that point, even the impotent system itself began referring to it as the Milky Way. Originally, Scylla dismissed this. He assumed that the original name of the galaxy had been Milky Way until the Thriskai laid claim to it, before naming and numbering it. This made sense. Until the system started referring to the sector as the Milky Way sector as well. And now, it was calling this horizon, the name for groups of sectors, the Milky Way horizon as well. Scylla didn't know how far this would go, or what the purpose of all of it was at this point. It had started off as something innocuous, and quickly became a mystery that left him baffled. But even then, he had so many other things to worry about that this loose end wasn't something he could spare much thought toward. Suddenly finding out that others cared enough to cross horizons to come and investigate, though. That changed everything. That was because this horizon, or, more accurately, this sky, the name for a group of horizons, was under the influence of the very same demigod Thriskai clan that had been completely wiped from existence. When Scylla got to this point in his thoughts, he became more confused. Logically, if this sky was under the control of that demigod Thriskai clan, then it only went to show that this logic should follow much the same. If they had once renamed things here, and were now destroyed, maybe the names had reverted. But there were two issues with this. First, the system, as Scylla understood it, was basically a program that cut corners wherever it could. You had to prove yourself to make it waste any of its processing power. That was why mounts couldn't be used in battle, or why it was so easy to trick, and likewise why it was so infuriated when it realized it had been tricked. Why would the system waste time flipping a name back to normal when it could get away with leaving it the same? That was the more complex reason this didn't make sense, but there was a far simpler reason. If the answer was that simple, and it was a simple name reversion, then the Veil humans wouldn't be here to investigate. They would have made the connection between the demigod Thriskai and the name changes. Of course, there was the chance that they were lying. But, this was quite a convoluted lie to use for no reason other than to save face and avoid being questioned about why they had come all the way here. The only conclusion that Scylla could come to was that there was indeed a secret here. Maybe if it had been before his time in the Golden Grove's secret realm, he would find all of this silly. But now, he knew what kind of power true names held, to the point that it could command the life of someone as powerful as the Duchess' father. It could be said that if the Duchess never told him her father's true name, even with his power-ups, Scylla would have been hard-pressed to come out of there alive. The Sanguara, their existence, that broken remnant system that they were under the control and at the mercy of. They too were tied to the legendary system of the past, weren't they? No, did Scylla really need something so recent to understand the importance of names? He had learned how important names were to the system from day one, hadn't he? If they were so unimportant, how had his name changed from Brown to Grimblade in the first place? Why did the system not acknowledge him as Scylla Brown? Suddenly, Scylla's eyes widened as something shook him to the core once again. Earth is in danger. Thinking of his mother, his father, his little sister, Cassere's parents, everyone he had left behind, a feeling that Scylla hadn't experienced in a very long time was welling up in his heart. Anxiety. Fear. Apprehension. Names were important, too important. But he had come across someone in the past who had changed their name. During his QuickTime event to kill Professor Broussard, a series of events that led him to trigger the awakening of his demonic will and nearly cost him his life several times, he had come across someone. Back then, he had almost killed Professor Broussard because she had become a traitor to Earth. Distraught over the death of her son, she felt like the governments of Earth didn't deserve her loyalty. The details of back then had been glossed over by Silas. He had come out on top, killed those that crossed his path, and stood unmatched. Plus, back then, he had finally made the decision to go to the Grimblade family and set things straight, killing those that needed to be killed and taking his real family away. Because of that, and because he couldn't have possibly pieced something like that together back then, he didn't give a damn about such a minor detail. Until now. Masquerade. Memories flashed by in Silas' mind. I met a man simply named Masquerade today. He's probably dead by now. A traitor through and through. Do you think his parents named him that? I don't know much about history, but I'm also fairly certain that a name like Grimblade was not common before the sixth summoning. Ellipsis. I'm a fool. The realization shook Silas' mind. He had had the answer right in front of him, but he missed it by a hair. Chapter 1440, A Death Wish. Back then, Masquerade's name change led him to make the connection that Archibald was a Grimblade. The deduction was simple enough. If names could be changed, then Archibald's last name had obviously been changed as well, obscuring the fact that he was a Grimblade all along from Silas. But he had missed the forest for the trees. How was name changing possible in the first place? This wasn't Silas concluding that the Grimblades and everyone else were traitors. Maybe some, but that wasn't the point. The point was that there was some method of changing something so fundamental on Earth, and the reason it had been left behind was equally important. All Silas knew now was that he had to make it back to Earth, and he had to make it back before the 2.5 months left to its completed evolution were through. But he had already triggered this Empyrean dungeon, and he had no way out until it was finished. A dangerous aura suddenly rippled out in all directions. I don't have time for this. Whether it was Nyara, Dusk, or any one of the others, they felt a chill run up their spines, all of them instinctively taking a step back. Krasil and Varric felt their smiles freeze. They had already felt like Silas' will was beyond their own, and quite frankly, Krasil was being more cheeky than anything else. He didn't actually expect Silas to know anything about such a large matter. But right now, all they could feel was danger. How do I speed this up? Silas asked the little girl. Defeat all potential challenges. There are decent odds the system might help you out if it's feeling generous. But the odds of that are low. Silas' jaw set, his anxiety fading from his eyes, replaced by a cold and calculating look. If he was going to do this, then he would need all of his mental faculties. There was no time to waste. His eyes turned to the two people behind Nyara. I'm challenging you. Give up like your leader did, or you can face the consequences. It's up to you. The result will be the exact same regardless. The two men beside Nyara suddenly frowned. What was going on here? Who do you? The notification popped up for one of the Lunar. Nyara didn't expect this sudden change either, and her heart couldn't help but leap out of her chest. What was going on? Why had Silas made this decision? To punish her for challenging him earlier. Wait, Envidon, you're not a match for him, just give. Envidon accepted the challenge. Furious, he unsheathed a twin pair of golden axes, surging toward Silas. Bang! Silas didn't even move. An invisible force descended from above with such force that Envidon was implanted into the ground. Give up or I kill you. You have 3 seconds. 3, 2. Knight Envidon Saloon accepts his defeat. Do you accept? Yes, no. Yes. You. Silas didn't spare Envidon another glance, looking at the third member of their lunar race group. This was even faster. The third lunar race member accepted the invitation to do battle and immediately gave up. Without a word, Silas' head turned toward the Enlaw race. They were an odd and inconspicuous bunch. They all rose on discs layered in complex etched runes. At first glance, it looked like they were little grey-skinned children on skateboards, but they radiated a sharp will beyond F-tiers of any race that Silas had encountered until these Veil humans showed up. You. Dresden Law's expression darkened, his eyes narrowed. There was a pulse at his forehead as a darker grey rune was etched into place. From what Silas could tell, it was actually complex enough to be a gene. In fact, it just might be the manifestation of some sort of unique gene. All 3 of these races, whether it was the Lunar, the Enlaw, or the Revolt, Silas had never met, come across, or even read about before. But each one was fascinating in its own right. The lunar seemed to only have cosmetic differences, but each one of them was a dual wielder for a reason. That wasn't because they were ambidextrous like he was, or because they just had abnormal flexibility. It was instead because of an odd mirroring ability they had. It was subtle and complicated to explain, and probably even more complicated to use, but they were capable of perfectly reflecting anything one half of their body experienced to the other half. They used this body offensively and defensively. Meaning, they only needed to train one half of their bodies to reflect the exact same level of skill in the other half. At that point, it would be a waste to not dual wield. But this was still the crudest and simplest explanation of their abilities. As for the Enlaw, their will and computational strength was off the charts. While the discs they flew on seemed simple, it was actually an act of defiance to the natural order. From what Silas could tell, they were actually flying not by telekinesis or some unique ability of their treasure, but actually as a form of training. They were constantly computing the laws of the world directly beneath them and countering them in real time, causing them to malfunction and resulting in a reversal of gravity. Once again, it was something that intrigued Silas because this was the exact sort of ability he needed to make Glassvolt Throne more powerful. But right now, he didn't give a damn. The instant Dresden accepted his challenge, the small grey young man moved, his arms flaring out and his robes flickering to reveal countless more little discs that spun through the air with menace. As they surged forward, they cut through ether, deconstructing it down and making it their own. By the time they got to Silas, they were orders of magnitude more powerful and seemingly capable of cutting through anything and everything. Silas reached out a hand, and Dresden sneered. A death wish. With the amount of power they had accumulated, those discs could completely deconstruct the laws around Silas, causing him to fall into an abyss of nothingness and fall to pieces, the fate of anyone without the laws of the world to support their existence. Dresden's sneer froze as Silas caught the discs out of the air, the others freezing under the effects of his telekinesis. He looked at it once, then squeezed down. The disc erupted into a flash of flames and then a trickle of ash, crumbling to nothing. This concludes the chapters for today. To continue the journey, be sure to find the next chapters on our channel. If you're excited about this story as we are, please like this video and subscribe. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on this chapters.